The pencil feels foreign in her hand. Too light, too simple, too dangerous. It's June 1945, Darmstadt Detention Center, American Zone of Occupation. The room smells of disinfectant and old wood. Sunlight cuts through barred windows, illuminating dust particles that dance like memories. Anneliese Becker, prisoner number 2847, stares at the blank paper in front of her. She's 23 years old. She hasn't written anything beyond her name and number in 8 months. An American officer, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison from Philadelphia, stands at the front of the makeshift classroom. She's holding a grammar textbook. In English, you'll learn to write, Morrison says in careful German. Stories, letters, whatever you want. Anneliese's hands shake, not from fear, from confusion. Why? She whispers to the woman next to her. Why would they teach us anything? That question would echo through post-war Germany for decades. Because what Anneliese did on Noah, none of the 847 German women prisoners in that facility knew was that they were about to become part of the most radical rehabilitation experiment in modern history. Within 3 months, these prisoners would be writing autobiographies, poetry, letters to families they'd lost contact with. During the war's chaos, they'd be reading American literature, debating philosophy, questioning everything they'd been taught to believe. And the architect of this transformation wasn't a social scientist or a philosopher. She was a 28-year-old Red Cross volunteer who believed that the way to defeat fascism wasn't through punishment. It was through giving people back their own voices. But first, they'd have to overcome something deeper than barbed wire and guard towers. They'd have to overcome the belief burned into them by years of totalitarian control that their words didn't matter, that their thoughts were dangerous. That silence was survival. How did a simple writing class in a prison camp become the template for democratic education across occupied Germany? How did women who'd been taught that their role was to obey without question become authors of their own narratives? The answer begins not in 1945, but 12 years earlier, when the Nazis began their systematic destruction of German literacy itself. To understand Anneliese's shock at being handed a pencil and told to write freely, we must go back to 1933. The year German education died and indoctrination was born. When Hitler took power, one of the first targets was the written word. Not books alone, though the book burnings of May 1933 were dramatic enough, but the very act of independent writing. In schools across Germany, composition assignments changed overnight. No more personal essays. No more creative writing. No more journals encouraging individual thought. Instead, propaganda reproduction. Students were graded on how accurately they could recite party doctrine. Teachers who encouraged critical thinking were dismissed. By 1935, 32% of German teachers had been replaced with party loyalists. Gerda Muller was a schoolteacher in Hamburg. In 1934, she assigned her students to write about their summer vacations. Used a simple personal essay. One student wrote about missing her Jewish friend who'd moved away. Innocent, honest, the words of a confused child trying to make sense of loss. Gerda was reported to the authorities. She spent 3 weeks in detention. The message was clear. Even children's words were state property. By 1938, German schools had eliminated creative writing entirely from the curriculum. Students learned to write exactly 2 things: business correspondence following rigid templates, and political essays that parroted Nazi ideology. What very few understood at the time was that this wasn't just censorship. It was cognitive control. The Nazis understood something profound. People who couldn't articulate their thoughts, couldn't resist the thoughts being planted in them. Anneliese Becker learned to write in this system. Born in 1922, she entered school in 1928, just as the Weimar Republic crumbled. By the time she was 11, she'd never written a single sentence that expressed her own opinion. She learned that words were weapons, that the wrong phrase could destroy your family, that silence was safer than expression, that true feelings were kept locked inside, where they couldn't be used against you. For 17 years, this was normal. This was how the world worked. You spoke the approved words. You wrote the approved sentences. Your inner life remained hidden, unexamined, unexpressed. and then Germany lost the war. This pattern of linguistic control wasn't unique to Nazi Germany, but they perfected it. Across occupied territories, similar systems emerged. The Soviet Union had been doing it for decades. Communist China would take it to new extremes. But in 1945, the Americans arrived with a different idea. A radical notion that would seem naive to cynics and revolutionary to prisoners. Literacy as liberation, writing as resistance against tyranny itself. The Allied planners had studied totalitarian education systems extensively. They understood that you couldn't create democracy by punishing people into compliance. You had to give them the tools to think democratically. One of those tools was writing. Personal, unmonitored, uncensored writing. The powder keg moment came in April 1945, when American forces began processing thousands of German women prisoners, political prisoners, collaborators, collaborators' wives, low-level party members, women caught in the machinery of a collapsing regime. Standard military protocol suggested minimal interaction, basic detention, process, and release. But Lieutenant Sarah Morrison saw something different. She saw women who couldn't articulate why they'd believed what they'd believed, who had no vocabulary for processing trauma, who'd spent their entire adult lives unable to express authentic thought. And then, on June 3, 1945, Morrison received permission to start what she called re-education through literacy. The first day of class, Annalise enters the room, expecting punishment, disguised as education. That's all she's known. 40 women. 20 tables. Stacks of paper. Pencils. Real pencils. Not the tiny stubs they've been allowed for filling out forms. Lieutenant Morrison doesn't start with grammar. She doesn't hand out textbooks. She does something completely unexpected. Write about water, she says in German. Anything. A memory. A description. A feeling. Just write about water. Annalise stares at the paper. The instruction makes no sense. There's no correct answer to copy. No party line to recite. No template to fill. Write. Anything. She'd been taught that writing was dangerous, that personal expression led to interrogation, that the wrong words could mean death. The woman next to her, Helga, a former postal clerk, starts crying. Not sad tears. Confused tears. The tears of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality is fracturing. I don't know how. Helga whispers. Morrison walks between the tables. There's no wrong answer, she says. No one will grade this. No one will judge it. These are your words. Write what you feel. Annalise picks up the pencil. Her hand hovers over the paper for 3 full minutes. Then, slowly, she writes, "Water is cold." 4 words. The first 4 words she's written in her own voice in 17 years. She stares at them, waiting for consequences, waiting for punishment, waiting for someone to tell her she's wrong. Instead, Morrison reads over her shoulder and nods. Good. What else? What Annalise had been taught. Words are weapons that'll be used against you. What she was discovering. Words are tools that belong to you. This revelation was happening simultaneously across the room. 40 women, each confronting the terrifying freedom of a blank page. Some wrote single sentences. Some filled pages with stream of consciousness observations. Some drew pictures because words felt too dangerous still. By the end of that first hour, something subtle but profound had shifted. They'd each created something that didn't require approval, that existed purely because they'd chosen to create it. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across American occupation zones in Germany, similar programs were emerging. In Munich, Heidelberg, Frankfurt educators were discovering that teaching democracy required more than lectures about voting. It required teaching people that their individual voices mattered, that personal narrative was valuable, that you could disagree without dying. But in Darmstadt, Anneliese Becker was at the epicenter of something even more radical than she realized. She was becoming the author of her own story, and that simple act, writing her own words, would ripple through German society in ways no military victory ever could. The writing program had infrastructure most prisoners didn't see. Behind Morrison's classroom was a carefully designed system for psychological rehabilitation through literacy. The U.S. military government had recruited dozens of educators, psychologists, and linguists for re-education teams. While Soviet zones focused on political indoctrination and British zones emphasized practical job training, Americans tried something different, treating education as therapy. They had three-tiered curriculum. Basic literacy for those who'd never learned properly, creative writing for intermediate students, and critical analysis for advanced learners. They had 15,000 confiscated books, German literature purged of Nazi propaganda. They had volunteer tutors who worked one-on-one with women struggling to express thoughts they'd suppressed for decades. But most surprising was the psychological framework. Every woman was assigned a literacy journal, a private notebook that guards couldn't read, administrators couldn't access, and the women controlled completely. Complete privacy, complete autonomy. The antithesis of totalitarian surveillance. The military government had allocated 40,000 pencils and 200,000 sheets of paper for detention facilities across the American zone, the equivalent of giving every prisoner a weapon that couldn't hurt anyone but could free everyone. Dr. Helen Jacobson, an educational psychologist from Columbia University, designed the curriculum. She'd studied Nazi education methods extensively. She understood that forcing people to write political essays about democracy would just replicate the system that had broken them. Instead, write about your grandmother's kitchen. Write about the last time you left. Write about sounds you miss. Personnel. Concrete. Apolitical. Human. What seemed like simple, creative exercises was actually sophisticated cognitive therapy. You can't articulate personal memory without accessing authentic self. You can't describe genuine emotion without recognizing you have an inner life separate from state propaganda. The system's weak point was the guards. Many were German civilians hired by Americans. They'd grown up in the same totalitarian system. To them, prisoners writing freely looked like prisoners plotting. Incident reports from July 1945 show guards confiscating journals, suspecting coded messages. American supervisors had to repeatedly clarify. The writing is private, not monitored, not evidence. This created strange inversions. Prisoners trusted American authorities more than German guards because Americans were granting more privacy than German systems ever had. Most surprising were the former Nazi women themselves. Party members, women who'd reported neighbors, who'd believed deeply in the ideology. They were the ones who struggled most with personal writing, not because they lacked literacy, because they lacked self. Years of subordinating individual thought to collective identity had eroded their ability to articulate personal truth. Gisela Ortmann, former League of German Girls leader, wrote in her first assignment, "I am not supposed to have personal opinions. That is selfish. That is weak," Morrison wrote in the margin. Why? That single word why was revolutionary. For women who'd been taught that questioning authority was treason, being asked why by authority itself created profound dissonance. Anneliese's third week in the program. Morrison introduces memoirs, real autobiographies written by ordinary people, not propaganda about great leaders, stories of normal lives. They read excerpts from working women's diaries, farmers' letters, an immigrant's account of coming to America, simple narratives of personal experience. Anneliese reads about a woman in Nebraska who wrote about learning to drive a tractor during wartime. Just a straightforward description of learning a new skill, finding pride in competence, making mistakes, and trying again. Nothing political. Nothing grand. Just a woman's lived experience, told in her own words, valued enough to preserve and publish. You want us to write like this? Anneliese asks. About ourselves. Yes, Morrison says. Your lives are worth writing about. Annalise faces an impossible choice. Writing truthfully means confronting what she believed, what she supported, what she failed to question. The comfortable narrative, I was just following orders. I didn't really understand, crumbles when you have to write your story honestly. She could write the comfortable version. Safe, vague, the story that lets her sleep at night. Or she could write truthfully, the messy version, the version where she made choices, where she could have asked questions but didn't, where silence was complicity. For 2 weeks, her journal stays mostly blank. A few sentences about daily routine. Nothing substantial. Nothing real. Then she reads about someone else's moral reckoning, an American essay by a Japanese American who'd been interned during the war, writing about anger at his own country, processing betrayal, working through complex, contradictory emotions, and he wasn't punished for it. His words were published, respected, part of a democratic conversation about difficult truths. That night, Annalise fills 8 pages. She writes about the day Jewish families were deported from her street, how she'd watched from behind curtains, how she'd told herself it wasn't her business, how she'd felt relieved her family wasn't among them. She writes about the shame of that relief, the cowardice of that silence. She doesn't show anyone, not yet. But she's written it. It exists. Her truth, in her words, on paper that she controls. Helga, her friend from that first class, discovers something different. She writes poetry, not political poetry, not patriotic verses. Personal poems about ordinary beauty, a cat in sunlight, the smell of bread, the weight of grief. She hasn't written poetry since she was 16, since her teacher told her that personal poetry was self-indulgent, since she learned that art served the state or it served nothing. Now she fills pages. Metaphors about trees and rivers and silence. Ways of processing trauma without naming it directly. Creating beauty as an act of reclamation. 6 months ago, Annalise had known exactly who she was supposed to be. Dutiful German woman. Supporter of the Reich. Someone whose personal thoughts were subordinate to collective goals. Now, she couldn't imagine going back to that silence, to that self-erasure. But this knowledge came with a price. Once you can articulate your complicity, you have to live with that articulation. Once you've written your truth, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. Freedom of expression isn't just liberating, it's terrifying. Because you become responsible for your own thoughts in ways you never were when someone else controlled your words. This pattern of transformation through writing wasn't limited to Darmstadt. Across 3 American zones, similar programs emerged with local variations. In Munich, Frau Katharina Schmidt-Former, factory supervisor, imprisoned for black market trading, wrote the first published memoir by a German woman prisoner. Between silence and speech, documented her journey from totalitarian subject to democratic citizen. It sold 40,000 copies in 6 months, mostly to other German women trying to understand their own complicity. She wrote, "For 12 years, I was afraid of my own thoughts. Now, I'm afraid of everyone else's silence." Her words captured something broader than personal experience. An entire generation of German women had learned to silence their inner lives. Taught that introspection was dangerous, that authentic self-expression could destroy families. Writing classes gave them permission to think again. To feel again, to name their experiences instead of burying them. Not everyone welcomed this change. In Stuttgart, a group of former party officials' wives protested the writing curriculum, called it American propaganda, insisted that personal writing was corrupting traditional German values. Their resistance revealed something important. For those who'd benefited from the system, the silence hadn't been oppressive. It had been comfortable. They didn't want liberation. They wanted validation of their choices. But they were outnumbered by women like Annalise, women who discovered that having words for their experience was the first step toward healing. In Frankfurt, In Frankfurt, Elisabeth Wagner, imprisoned for distributing resistance leaflets during the war, became a writing instructor herself. A prisoner teaching other prisoners, an inversion that would have been unthinkable under any previous system. She taught women who'd been her ideological enemies, former party members, collaborators, women who would have reported her to the Gestapo just months earlier. Her first lesson: write about someone you've hated, not what you think about them, what you feel when you remember them. Be honest. The exercise forced confrontation. Humanization. You can't write honestly about hating someone without exploring why, without seeing them as complex, without recognizing your own complexity. For Elisabeth Wagner, the price was steep. Teaching her former enemies meant recognizing their humanity, meant acknowledging they were capable of change, meant letting go of righteous anger that had sustained her through dark times. She wrote in her own journal, "I wanted revenge. What I got was conversation. I'm not sure which is harder." By November 1945, the writing program had expanded beyond prisons. American authorities were implementing literacy curriculum in all German schools, retraining teachers, introducing creative writing assignments, encouraging critical thinking. But the opposition to this transformation was systematic and organized, and it came from unexpected sources. Not everyone wanted German women learning to think independently. Some German politicians, even in the Western zones, worried about American feminization of German culture. Traditional roles were being disrupted. Women who'd learned to write their own stories were less likely to return to silent submission. Conservative German church leaders opposed the curriculum, worried that teaching women critical thinking would undermine family authority structures. One Catholic bishop wrote to American authorities, "Woman's dignity lies in humble service, not self-expression." American authorities ignored him, pressed forward. But resistance came from within the occupation government too. Some American military officials thought literacy programs were wasteful. Resources should go toward physical reconstruction, they argued. Roads, factories, housing, not poetry classes for prisoners. In August 1945, military budget reviews threatened their writing programs, called them non-essential cultural initiatives. Lieutenant Morrison wrote a 27-page defense. She argued that you can't build democracy on rubble and resentment. You need citizens capable of critical thought, of self-governance, of articulating needs and negotiating compromises. Her argument won. Barely. The programs continued. The propaganda battle was subtler. German Communist Party literature began circulating in detention centers. Calling the American programs Borgo's individualism, argued that personal writing distracted from collective class struggle. Soviet zone literature featured different narratives. German women prisoners learning political theory, studying Marx, writing essays about capitalist exploitation. Identical method education through writing, but diametrically opposed goals. Soviets wanted ideological conversion. Americans wanted ideological independence. Some German women, particularly those from working-class backgrounds, found communist arguments compelling. The personal seemed selfish when millions were starving. Writing about grandmother's kitchen felt trivial compared to rebuilding a shattered nation. Even Ilse Brenner, a committed socialist, before the war, began to question the American approach. She wrote to Morrison, "How does my poetry help Germany recover? How does my personal narrative feed hungry children?" Morrison's response was profound. A nation of people who can only think collectively cannot remain free. Every totalitarian system, Nazi, communist, fascist, starts by erasing individual voice. We're giving it back. That's the foundation everything else is built on. The moment came in December 1945 when an undeniable event shifted the debate. The Nuremberg trials began presenting evidence of concentration camps. The full scale of atrocities became public, documented, undeniable. German civilians, especially women who'd claimed ignorance, had to confront what had been done in their names. by their government with their silent consent. The writing classes became processing spaces. Grief, guilt, horror, disbelief, complex, contradictory emotions that had no outlet in political speeches or collective apologies. Women wrote, privately, honestly, painfully. Some destroyed what they wrote. Immediately authors kept Italiano, needed to name what they felt before they could move forward. Anna Lass wrote 19 pages in 3 days. About Jewish classmates who disappeared. About propaganda she'd believed. About how easily she'd accepted simple explanations for complex horrors. About the comfort of not asking questions. She never showed it to anyone. But she wrote it, named it, owned it. And in that act writing her complicity, her guilt, her grief, she began the work of becoming someone different, someone capable of moral agency, someone who wouldn't be silent again. The climax comes in February 1946. The detention center has transformed. No longer just a prison. Now it's part rehabilitation center, part school, part community of women rebuilding their understanding of themselves. Annalise has been writing for 8 months. She's filled 3 journals, personal essays, letters she never sent, attempts at poetry. Honest reckoning with her choices. Morrison announces a publication project, German Women's Voices, Testimonies from Transition. A collection of writings from the program. Anonymous, if the authors choose, but real. Published. Permanent. And then Annalise saw something that changed everything. On Morrison's desk, a letter from a German Jewish woman living in New York, a survivor who'd read about the literacy program in newspapers. She'd written, "If Germans can learn to name what they've done, to write their truth, maybe there's hope. Not forgiveness, I can't offer that, but hope that the next generation won't repeat the same silence." A survivor, extending hope, not because Germans deserved it, because honesty created possibility for change. Annalise stands in that office, reading and rereading that letter. She'd expected eternal condemnation. She'd deserved it. But here was something more complex. Recognition that transformation is possible, that people who participate in evil can become people who resist evil, if they can articulate what they've done, if they can own their choices, if they can commit to different choices going forward. Show mass realization spreading through the detention center. Multiple women converging on the same truth. Writing their stories doesn't erase what happened, but silence ensures it can happen again. By March 1946, 73 women from Darmstadt submitted pieces for publication. Essays, poems, testimonials. Some signed their real names. Others used pseudonyms. All honest. What no one had known was that Lieutenant Morrison herself was a German Jewish immigrant. Her family had escaped in 1937. She'd anglicized her name, joined the military, and returned to Germany as part of occupation forces. She taught German women to write not out of naive optimism, but out of fierce belief that silence enabled atrocity, that fascism died when people could articulate their doubts, question their leaders, name their complicity. She revealed this in the book's introduction, explained why she dedicated herself to this work. Not for reconciliation, she wasn't ready for that. For prevention. So the next generation of German women would have tools to resist. The immediate aftermath was complicated. Some German women felt manipulated. You were Jewish, and you didn't tell us. Others felt it validated the work. You had every reason to hate us. You chose to teach us instead. For Morrison, the victory was bittersweet. She'd given these women literacy, tools for democratic citizenship, personal agency. But she'd done it knowing that no amount of education could undo what had been done. No amount of personal transformation could resurrect the murdered. Teaching people to write their truth is powerful, but it doesn't change the truth itself. It just makes sure it can't be forgotten or denied. The writing program transformed into permanent institutions across Western Germany. Volkshochschulen, people's high schools offering adult education, creative writing, critical literacy, open, to everyone. By 1948, over 400,000 German women had participated in writing classes sponsored by occupation authorities. They'd produced thousands of personal narratives, poems, essays, creating an archive of collective reckoning. Remember Anneliese Becker, who'd written "Water is Cold" as her first independent sentence? 20 years later, in 1965, she would publish a memoir, Finding My Voice After Silence. It documented her journey from totalitarian subject to democratic citizen, from complicity to consciousness. Her book's dedication to Lieutenant Morrison, who taught us that our words mattered, and to those whose words were silenced forever. May we never forget either. What seemed like simple literacy classes would eventually reshape German democratic culture entirely. The generation of women who learned to write personally, honestly, critically. They raised children differently, encouraged questions, valued individual expression, resisted authoritarian simplicity. West Germany's robust civil society, its strong democratic institutions, its reckoning with the past, these didn't emerge from military occupation alone. They came from millions of individual Germans learning to think critically, to articulate uncomfortable truths, to write their own narratives instead of accepting state-provided stories. The real heirs of this change were the next generation. Germans born in the 1950s and 60s who grew up in homes where questioning authority was normal, where personal conscience was valued, whereas just following orders was recognized as moral abdication. This generation would challenge their parents, demand truth about the Nazi years, push for deeper reckoning, because they'd been raised by women who'd learned that silence enables atrocity. But the cost was permanent. Germany would never be able to ignore its past. The written records, all those personal testimonies, those honest reckonings ensured that every generation would have to confront what had been done, what had been allowed, what silence had enabled. Today, Germany has mandatory Holocaust education, memorials in every city, a culture of Vergengenheitsbelt, coming to terms with the past. This didn't happen naturally. It happened because people like Anneliese wrote their truth, made it impossible to forget or deny. The connection to present day is urgent. In an era of rising authoritarianism globally, of leaders who call press enemies of the people, of movements that dismiss personal testimony as fake news, Germany remembers what happens when citizens lose their voices, when writing becomes dangerous, when personal narrative is suppressed, when silence is enforced. The literacy programs of 1945 weren't just about education. They were about ensuring Germans understood viscerally, personally, the connection between freedom of expression and democratic survival. You can't have citizens in a democracy if those citizens can't articulate their own thoughts, can't write their own stories, can't question authority, can't name injustice. Anneliese Becker died in 2001 at age 79. Among her possessions, 15 years of journals, thousands of pages documenting her evolution from silent complicity to vocal citizenship. Also, that first piece of paper from June 1945, "Water is Cold," for words that represented the beginning of everything. In her final interview for a German documentary project, she said, "Morrison didn't just teach us to write, she taught us that we were capable of thought, of change, of becoming better than we'd been. That was the most dangerous, most necessary lesson of all." She was asked, "What do you want people to understand about those writing classes?" "They saved us," she said. "Not from prison, from ourselves, from the silence that had made us accomplices. They gave us words when we'd forgotten we had voices, and once you remember you have a voice, you can never accept silence again." The lesson wasn't just that education defeats fascism. It was deeper. Personal agency is the foundation of political freedom. You cannot have democracy without citizens capable of independent thought, and you cannot have independent thought without the ability to articulate it, to write it, to claim it, to defend it. This wasn't just about Germany recovering from war. It was about humanity learning that freedom isn't just the absence of oppression. It's the presence of voice, of the ability to say, "This is my truth, written in my words, and it matters." The old detention center in Darmstadt still stands. It's a museum now. On the wall of the former classroom, excerpts from prisoners' writings, Annelies's forward beginning, Helga's poetry, Elizabeth's reflections on teaching former enemies, and a plaque. Here, in defeat, we found our voices. Here, in captivity, we learned freedom. Words saved us when weapons failed us. May we never be silent again. That simple classroom, those stacks of paper, those women learning to write their truth, a small moment in vast history. But small moments accumulate into movements, into cultures, into nations, transformed. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison gave German women pencils and paper. What she really gave them was the most powerful weapon against tyranny ever created. The ability to tell their own stories, to think their own thoughts, to become authors of their own lives. And once you've written your own story, no one can write it for you ever again.